Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about the semicolon, which is a noble piece of punctuation that is often misused. In part, we're going to do this because this semester, I have seen a lot of my students use semicolons incorrectly. So I want to talk about what a semicolon does, when you would use it, and when you wouldn't use it. So basically, a semicolon is a piece of punctuation that connects two closely interrelated sentences. So with a semicolon, you're looking at two clauses in that sentence, each of which could be their own sentence. So they're grammatically complete, subject, object, verb. They may be more complex than that, but at the very least, subject, object, verb. You got one sentence connected with a semicolon to another sentence. This is the basic function of them. They connect two ideas that are so closely interconnected, so closely interrelated that they can be combined into one complete thought, one complete sentence, but grammatically they could stand on their own. How do you determine, I hear you cry, whether or not two sentences are closely enough related to deserve a semicolon? There aren't really hard and fast rules that I'm aware of for this. It is in large part a matter of judgment. But typically, if the second sentence modifies the first sentence in some way, I would suggest that's a good place to use a semicolon. So if the idea in the second sentence develops or complicates or challenges or something like this, the idea in the first sentence in such a way that they could theoretically be rewritten into one sentence, that would be a pretty good justification. So I want us to take a look at a couple of examples. So I'm going to share this document here. This is 4 sentences that I've created, 3 of which are created for this specific video, and one of which is taken from an essay that I published. So this first one, this is a very basic example. The dog barked, semicolon, it was loud. Each of these is a complete sentence in and of itself. We could have the dog barked, period, it was loud, period. That would be perfectly grammatically correct. But because these two things are interconnected, because the second sentence, it was loud, modifies the first, the dog barks, it provides us more information about that bark, we can make a good case that a semicolon is justified here. So it links these two sentences into one complete idea. And we could rewrite this. Actually, it would probably be better to rewrite this into something like the dog barked loudly, something like that. It's more concise, more active voice, etc., etc. But that's not the point that I'm making in this video. The point that I'm making in this video is that this would be how you typically use a semicolon to connect two thoughts together, two sentences together, in such a way that it's clear grammatically, it's clear to the reader that these are specifically linked ideas. So this sentence, this second sentence here, this is actually from a paper that I published several years ago now. In this sense, the war on terror mentality represents a continuation of the American worldview shaped by the Cold War, semicolon. The war on terror did not change U.S. culture, but merely intensified trends already fundamental to the U.S. self-image. In this case, again, we've got two sentences, each of which, these are more complex sentences, each of which is capable of standing on its own. In this sense, the war on terror mentality represents a continuation of the American worldview shaped by the Cold War, period. That's fine. That works as a sentence. We can definitely do that. And then we've got the second thing. So in this case, it would be, the, with a capital T, the war on terror did not change US culture, but merely intensified trends already fundamental to the US self-image. Again, this is a perfectly fine standalone sentence, but because these two ideas are closely related, the idea in the first sentence introduces the idea that the war on terror continues a Cold War worldview. The second sentence modifies it. This was not a fundamental change, it was an intensification. So these two ideas are linked, they are closely connected, and so the semicolon here is justified. Now, one very common error that I've been seeing this semester with semicolons, I'm going to turn on track changes here for just a second, is that what we see in this third sentence. Using a semicolon to introduce a serial list or a subordinate clause, neither of which is a correct use of a semicolon. So particularly if you're using this to introduce a list is generally not a standalone sentence. So in this example, we've got, she used scientific equipment, semicolon, beakers, test tubes, and a Bunsen burner. This should not be a semicolon. If we're going to do this, what it should be is a colon. A proper colon, the two dots rather than the dot with a comma at the bottom. The colon in this context serves to tell the reader that what comes next is the information introduced in the prefatory clause. So she used scientific equipment, in this case is the prefatory clause, and then the colon tells us now we're getting the information introduced there. But these are not two standalone sentences. The first clause is, she used scientific equipment, period, boom, perfect, it works as its own sentence. But if we just take beakers, test tubes, and a Bunsen burner, this isn't a complete sentence. It's a list, and it works as a list, but it doesn't work as a complete sentence, and so it shouldn't have the semicolon there. It's grammatically not the function of a semicolon. Now, there is one other situation in which you will use a semicolon, and this is much more rare, but it's what we see in this final example here, which is when you have a list of lists, or a list of serial things. So as you probably know, hopefully know, the way that you indicate a list is with commas after each item. And I do use the Oxford comma. So fruits, comma, vegetables, comma, and trees. That's the Oxford comma when you have a comma between the last two items of a list. Some people don't do that, so it would just be fruits, comma, vegetables, and trees. To me, that's not grammatically correct, but it is a common usage. It is what it is. We're not dealing with that right now. This is not an Oxford comma video. This is a semicolon video. So why might you use a semicolon within lists? Well, when you've got multiple items when you've got items with commas in them. So in this case, he loved listing fruits, colon. So that's our prefatory sentence, then the colon, as we just saw up here with the scientific equipment. But then we've got three lists here: fruits, vegetables, and trees, continents, countries, and cities, board games, word games, and video games. So what we've got is a list of lists. Three lists in a list. It's meta listing. And so what you do is you use a semicolon between the lists to indicate a break in those lists. So fruits, vegetables, and trees, that's divided with commas, but then we get a semicolon before continents, countries, and cities. This semicolon is a kind of master comma in this context. So it is the comma between lists of things divided with commas, basically, if that makes sense. That may be more confusing. Basically, yeah, when you've got a set of things in a list, and then you need to introduce another list, a semicolon is going to divide them. You may also do this when you've got lists that have subclauses in them, separated off by commas. That one's maybe more. That one may be less common, more obscure as a way of doing things. But basically, whenever you've got a list and then there's commas within the individual items on that list, a semicolon becomes the master comma that divides up the larger list itself. So that's the sort of basic elements of the semicolon. It's not super difficult necessarily to understand what a semicolon does. It's sometimes difficult to figure out whether or not a semicolon is justified in a particular instance. And it can be tempting to put semicolons in the wrong place. But basically, semicolons should generally be used relatively sparingly. So that's my sort of final advice about the semicolon. As cool a piece of punctuation as it is, don't wear it out.